The year was 1841 and Hartford, Connecticut, stood at the heart of New England's growing prosperity. Cobblestone streets bustled with horse-drawn carriages, merchants shouted prices in the market square, and church bells rang across the Connecticut River. Hartford was a town where reputation mattered, where families guarded their honor, and where a wedding was more than a union of two people. It was a declaration of future stability, prosperity, and community trust. Among all the weddings that year, none created as much anticipation as the marriage of Jonathan Pierce and Catherine Miller. Their union was spoken of not only because of the family's respectability, but also because of the remarkable characters of the bride and groom. Jonathan, the groom, was a young merchant in his late 20s, known for honesty in trade and for his kind dealings with both customers and workers. His shop in the town square sold imported cloth, fine tea, and tools from Boston and New York. In an era when dishonesty in business was not uncommon, Jonathan's word was regarded as a bond. He had built his modest success by working long hours, managing his accounts carefully, and treating others with fairness. Many saw him as a young man destined for larger achievements. The bride, Catherine Miller, was the daughter of a schoolmaster. She had grown up surrounded by books, hymns, and the values of faith and diligence. Catherine was admired for her quiet intelligence and her generous spirit. She often volunteered to teach the children of poorer families how to read and write after their parents had dismissed education as a luxury. To the townspeople, she embodied the virtues of kindness and patience. She was not wealthy, but her character shone brighter than gold. As the wedding day approached, excitement spread across Hartford. The church was decorated with garlands of ivy and white roses, gathered by neighbors and friends. Women in the town prepared pies, cakes, and preserves to contribute to the feast, while men ensured that wagons of firewood and barrels of cider were ready for the gathering. For a community still recovering from economic uncertainty in the 1830s, such an event promised a much-needed moment of joy and togetherness. On the morning of the wedding, the Pierce household buzzed with activity. Servants polished silver dishes, laid out white linens, and arranged the tables where the feast would later take place. Guests from neighboring towns arrived in their finest attire, men in black frock coats, women in silk bonnets and flowing skirts. The air was filled with laughter, greetings, and the clatter of carriage wheels as relatives long separated reunited for the happy occasion. Inside the Miller home, Catherine prepared for her new life. She wore a gown of cream-colored satin, simple yet elegant, adorned only with a lace veil made by her late grandmother. Friends admired her calm composure, though nervous. She carried herself with quiet dignity. Catherine's father, though not wealthy, had given all he could to ensure his daughter's wedding was memorable. With trembling hands, he fastened a small silver cross around her neck, whispering, "May God protect you and guide you." The church filled quickly. Children squeezed onto pews beside their parents, eager to see the bride. The organ began its solemn tune as Catherine entered, her arm linked with her father's. Gasps rippled through the crowd at her beauty, not of extravagance but of purity and grace. Jonathan, standing at the altar, felt his heart race as he caught sight of her. To him, Catherine was not only his bride, but the very promise of a brighter, more hopeful future. The minister spoke of love, duty, and the sanctity of marriage. He reminded the couple that marriage was not only a personal vow, but a covenant before God and community. With steady voices, Jonathan and Catherine exchanged their vows. When Jonathan placed the ring upon Catherine's finger, the church bells rang in celebration, echoing across the town. Applause broke out, and the congregation rose to sing a hymn of blessing. Following the ceremony, the wedding party made its way to the Pierce residence for the feast. Long tables were laden with roasted meats, bread, vegetables, puddings, and cakes. Cider and wine flowed freely as toasts were made to the young couple. Laughter filled the air, and neighbors declared it the most joyous wedding Hartford had seen in years. To the outside eye, it was a perfect day, a day when love, community, and tradition blended seamlessly. People whispered that Jonathan and Catherine's union would be a blessing not only for their families but for the town itself. Many young women looked at Catherine with admiration, hoping to one day find a husband as devoted as Jonathan. Young men, in turn, admired Jonathan's steadfastness and hoped for marriages as blessed as his, yet, beneath the merriment and celebration, shadows lingered. Jonathan's mother, Mrs. Pierce, though outwardly polite, remained reserved. She stood apart from the cheer, her eyes rarely meeting Catherine's. To others, her detachment was brushed aside as fatigue or the quiet reserve of a matron unused to large gatherings. But those who looked closer might have seen in her eyes something more troubling, a bitterness she kept hidden behind a strained smile. Still, no one dared dwell on such thoughts. After all, weddings were moments to cherish, not to question. Guests sang songs, danced to fiddle tunes, and embraced the night with joy. As the candles flickered and the feast continued, no one could imagine the storm that would soon shatter the happiness of Hartford's most celebrated wedding. At that moment, Hartford knew only joy, the kind that comes when love is young, when families gather in peace, and when the future seems unshakably bright. Though the day of the wedding had brought laughter and harmony to Hartford, one heart within the Pierce family home beat with a dissonant rhythm. That heart belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Pierce, Jonathan's mother. To the guests, she appeared as a figure of dignity, dressed in dark silk, her hair drawn back in a severe bun, her back straight as a rod. She stood quietly during the vows, spoke little during the feast, and offered only the faintest of smiles when others congratulated her on gaining a daughter. But beneath her composed exterior, a tempest brewed. Eleanor Pierce was a woman who had lived her life under the shadow of control. She was a widow, her husband having passed away years before from a fever, leaving her to manage both the household and the family's reputation. She prided herself on keeping order, on commanding respect, and on ensuring that her son Jonathan carried the Pierce name with honor. To her, Jonathan was more than a son. He was her last anchor, the proof that all her sacrifices had meaning. So when Jonathan declared his intention to marry Catherine Miller, Eleanor's heart hardened. Catherine was not from a wealthy family, nor did she bring with her the dowry or social connections that Eleanor had long hoped for. To Eleanor, Catherine's sweetness and intelligence were nothing more than disguises for inadequacy. She muttered to herself that a schoolmaster's daughter could never manage the Pierce household with the dignity it deserved. It wasn't just pride that stirred resentment, it was fear. Eleanor feared being replaced. For years, Jonathan had confided in her, sought her counsel, and relied on her for guidance in business and personal matters. She had been the center of his world, but Catherine, young, beautiful, kind, threatened to draw him away. In Catherine's presence, Eleanor felt invisible, as though all the years of devotion and sacrifice might vanish into obscurity. During the wedding preparations, these feelings deepened. While neighbors and friends admired Catherine's modest gown and gracious demeanor, Eleanor could only see reminders of her own waning influence. When Jonathan smiled at his bride-to-be, Eleanor noted that it was a smile he no longer gave to her. Each compliment Catherine received, each blessing spoken over the young couple, seemed like an insult to Eleanor's place in her son's heart. She concealed these feelings behind a mask of civility. To others, she spoke kindly enough, never allowing her bitterness to spill into public view. She praised the wedding arrangements, nodded at compliments, and kept her voice measured. But inside, her thoughts turned darker with every passing hour. On the day of the wedding itself, while the town celebrated, Eleanor watched Catherine closely. She noted how Catherine carried herself with ease, how the crowd adored her, how Jonathan's eyes rarely left her face. Every detail, instead of softening Eleanor's heart, fed her resentment. It was as though Catherine had stolen her rightful place. When the feast began, Eleanor found herself standing at the edge of the room, watching the young bride surrounded by laughter and love. The more she watched, the more her jealousy twisted into anger. She thought of all she had endured, years of widowhood, of running the household, of keeping the Pierce name respected. And now, after all that sacrifice, this young woman would come into her home, sleep under her roof, and carry away her son's loyalty. It was in this storm of emotions that a dangerous seed took root. Where another mother might have chosen acceptance, Eleanor chose bitterness. Where forgiveness might have healed her heart, pride deepened the wound. She convinced herself that Catherine had taken what rightfully belonged to her, and with each passing moment, that conviction grew sharper, more poisonous. The tragedy of Eleanor's resentment was not only in its cruelty but in its blindness. She failed to see Catherine's respect for her, the efforts the young bride had made to win her approval, the gentle words she spoke in private about wishing to learn from her. Catherine had wanted to honor Eleanor, not replace her, but Eleanor's pride distorted every gesture into an offense. Neighbors noticed Eleanor's distance, but excused it as fatigue or the solemnity of a widow unused to merriment. None guessed that in the quiet of her mind, Eleanor was weighing thoughts far darker than disapproval. She told herself she only wanted to protect her son, but beneath that excuse lay the harsher truth. She could not bear to share him. Such is the nature of silent resentment. It grows in secret, unseen by others, until it consumes the heart entirely. While others laughed and raised toasts that evening, Eleanor sat in the shadows, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the bride. Every smile, every word of affection between Jonathan and Catherine was like a blade against her pride. And so, the woman who should have been the bride's protector, guide, and second mother, allowed envy to fester into something monstrous. She did not yet act, but the decision was already being written in the bitterness of her heart. Resentment had become her master, and it would soon drive her toward an act that would not only shatter her son's happiness, but stain her own soul forever. In Hartford, people would later say that tragedy often begins not with one great crime, but with a small seed of jealousy left unchecked. If Eleanor had chosen humility, if she had chosen gratitude for her son's joy, history might have remembered the wedding as the beginning of a legacy of love. Instead, her silent resentment became the spark that lit a fire of destruction. The wedding feast of Jonathan Pierce and Catherine Miller was the talk of Hartford. After the vows had been exchanged in the ivy-decked church, after the bells had pealed their joyful notes across the town, guests made their way to the Pierce residence, where long tables were arranged beneath a canopy of lanterns. The September air was cool and sweet, and the entire household seemed lit not only by candles, but by the glow of hope for the newlyweds' future. Neighbors, friends, and relatives gathered with eager anticipation. Farmers brought baskets of apples and pears, freshly picked from the orchards. Bakers contributed warm loaves, and the women of the town prepared pies and puddings. Roasted meats filled the air with their rich aroma, mingling with the sharp sweetness of spiced cider. Children laughed as they darted between tables, and elders exchanged stories of their own youth, recalling the joy of weddings long past. The bride and groom were radiant. Jonathan wore the proud but humble smile of a man who had found his life's companion, while Catherine glowed with a serene grace, her hand never far from her husband's arm. Their presence seemed to elevate the entire gathering, reminding all who watched that love, pure and steadfast, was the greatest blessing a human heart could possess. But among the sea of joy, one figure remained cold: Mrs. Eleanor Pierce. She sat upright at the head table, her lips thin, her eyes calculating, her presence stiff as if carved from stone. Those who greeted her were met with courteous nods, but little warmth. Some chalked it up to her widow's temperament, a seriousness that never left her since her husband's passing. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, Eleanor's heart burned with envy. As the guests enjoyed the merriment, Eleanor excused herself to the kitchen. There, away from prying eyes, she enacted the decision her bitterness had whispered to her in the days leading up to the wedding. She carried with her a small vial, its contents clear and deadly. Arsenic obtained under the pretense of killing household pests. Her hands did not tremble as she worked. Methodically, almost ritualistically, she poured the poison into a silver goblet intended for Catherine. She stirred it into the wine, watching as the liquid swallowed the crystals without trace. For a moment, she stared into the cup, as though testing her own resolve. Voices echoed from the hall. The laughter of Jonathan, the sweet tones of Catherine, the clinking of glasses raised in toasts. Eleanor's face hardened. "It is better this way," she murmured to herself. "Better now than later." When she returned to the hall, no one questioned her. She moved gracefully among the guests, carrying the goblet with the calm authority of a hostess. At the head table, she placed it gently before Catherine, her eyes fixed on the young bride with a smile that betrayed nothing. The toasts began. Friends rose to honor Jonathan, praising his integrity. Others spoke of Catherine's kindness and her devotion to family and faith. Each word of admiration fell like a hammer on Eleanor's heart, yet she masked her emotions behind polite applause. At last, Jonathan himself stood, raising his glass to thank the guests for their love and support. "Tonight," he declared, "we do not celebrate wealth or power, but the bond of two souls who seek to walk together in faith, in duty, and in love. May our union bring joy not only to ourselves but to all who surround us." Applause thundered through the hall, and Catherine, with tears in her eyes, lifted her goblet in response. She glanced at Jonathan, smiling with that quiet, radiant expression that had won his heart, and then she drank. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The feast continued, music filled the air, and guests danced and laughed. Catherine even laughed herself, sharing stories with her bridesmaids. But as the minutes passed, her laughter faded. She pressed a hand to her chest, her smile weakening. Jonathan noticed immediately, leaning toward her. "Are you well, my love?" he asked softly. Catherine tried to nod, but her face grew pale. A sudden wave of pain crossed her features, and she gasped. The hall fell into silence as she clutched the edge of the table. Guests rushed to her side, confusion and alarm spreading like wildfire. Within moments, Catherine collapsed, her goblet clattering to the floor. Jonathan caught her in his arms, his voice breaking with panic. "Catherine, speak to me!" Chaos erupted. The town's physician, who had been among the guests, pushed through the crowd to examine her. But her breathing was shallow, her pulse faint. A hush descended as the physician's grim expression revealed what none dared to say aloud. Something more than faintness had seized her. The feast that had begun in joy dissolved into despair. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, guests whispered in horror, and Jonathan cried out, begging God for mercy. Catherine, barely conscious, managed only to whisper his name before falling limp in his arms. And all the while, Eleanor sat frozen at the head of the table. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale but composed. She did not rush forward, nor did she cry out. To the guests, her stillness seemed the stoic restraint of a widow. But within her heart, a storm raged, a mixture of triumph, regret, and a cold dread that the act she had committed could never be undone. The night that was meant to bind two families together had become a night of tragedy. The tables of food stood untouched, the music silenced, the laughter replaced by sobs. Hartford would never forget it. The poisoned feast had claimed its victim, and with it, the innocence of a community that had gathered to celebrate love. What should have been a blessing turned into a curse, all because one woman allowed resentment to fester into hatred. The wedding feast that had begun with laughter and music now stood drowned in horror. Only moments earlier, Catherine Miller had lifted her goblet in a gesture of joy, her smile radiant beneath the lanterns that hung above the Pierce estate. Now, she lay collapsed in her husband's arms, her face pale as linen, her breath shallow and uneven. The transformation was so sudden that many could hardly believe their eyes. "Catherine," Jonathan cried, his voice breaking as he shook her gently, trying to rouse her. Her lips moved faintly, whispering his name, but no sound followed. The goblet that had slipped from her hand lay shattered on the floor, its contents seeping into the cracks of the wooden boards, like a shadow spreading across the room. Panic swept through the hall. Guests rose from their seats, some rushing forward to help, others frozen in fear. The children, sensing the gravity of the moment, clung to their mother's skirts. The fiddler who had been readying his bow set the instrument down in silence. The town physician, Dr. Aberworth, a stern yet compassionate man in his 50s, knelt beside the young bride. He felt her pulse, examined her eyes, and gently pressed his hand against her stomach. His face grew grim. "Fetch water," he ordered sharply. Quickly, servants rushed forward with pitchers, but when Catherine attempted to sip, her throat convulsed. Rejecting the drink, she coughed violently, her body trembling as though some unseen fire burned within her. Jonathan clutched her hand, tears streaking his face. "Hold on, Catherine. Please, you must hold on." Dr. Aberworth's hands trembled slightly as he examined the residue left on her lips. He recognized the signs: the burning throat, the sudden pallor, the violent spasms. He had seen it once before, years ago, in a farmer who had mistakenly ingested poison meant for rats. The symptoms were unmistakable. He looked up, his eyes filled with unspoken truth, but in that moment he could not bear to announce it aloud. To declare that Catherine was poisoned at her own wedding feast was to pronounce a curse upon the entire gathering. The room held its breath as Catherine's condition worsened. She clutched Jonathan's hand with desperate strength, her eyes searching his face as if trying to memorize every detail before the darkness claimed her. "Stay with me, Catherine," Jonathan whispered. "We have a lifetime yet, please, not tonight." Her lips parted, and though no one else could hear, Jonathan swore he caught the faintest words. "I love you." Then her body convulsed once more, and her hand slipped from his grasp. A wail tore from Jonathan's throat as he pressed his face against hers. Refusing to believe what was happening, guests wept openly, some sinking to their knees in prayer, others turning away in anguish. The joy of the evening had been shattered beyond repair. The physician finally rose, his expression bleak. "She is gone," he whispered. "The bride is dead." The words hung heavy in the air, crushing what remained of the celebration. Mothers sobbed, fathers shook their heads in disbelief, and the children, sensing the despair of their elders, began to cry. The tables laden with food stood untouched, the lanterns flickered above as though mocking the tragedy below, and the music that had filled the air only an hour before now seemed a cruel memory. Jonathan refused to let go. He cradled Catherine in his arms, rocking her gently as though she were only sleeping. "No," he muttered again and again. "This cannot be, not Catherine, not tonight." But reality would not bend to his grief. The life that had once illuminated Catherine's eyes had been snuffed out, leaving only silence where laughter had been. The news spread through Hartford like wildfire. Before dawn, neighbors and townsfolk whispered of the shocking death. The bride, who had entered the church radiant with joy, had left the world before she could even cross the threshold of her new home. The wedding, meant to be a celebration of beginnings, had become a tale of endings, and suspicion, though unspoken at first, began to stir. Some muttered that it was illness, a sudden attack of the heart, or perhaps a hidden weakness in the bride's health. But others, recalling the sudden collapse, the strange convulsions, and the residue upon her lips, whispered darker thoughts. Had she been poisoned? Eyes turned quietly toward Mrs. Eleanor Pierce. She had not wept as others had. She sat at the head of the table, her face pale and her hands folded tightly in her lap. Some excused her stillness as the composure of a widow. Others noted that her gaze had rarely left Catherine during the feast. Few dared to speak their suspicions aloud, but in the silence of their hearts many wondered. Jonathan, however, thought only of his loss. In the days that followed, he was seen wandering the streets in grief, his shop closed, his voice broken. He could not be comforted, for his wife had been taken from him before their life together had even begun. Catherine's funeral was held within the week. The church that had so recently rung with wedding bells now tolled with the somber sound of mourning. Black draped carriages lined the street, and townsfolk filled the pews to overflowing. Her coffin, small and simple, was covered with lilies, their fragrance mingling with the scent of incense and sorrow. Jonathan stood at the front, pale and hollow-eyed, his hand resting on the coffin as though still unwilling to let her go. The minister spoke of life's uncertainty, of the need to cherish every moment, and of the mystery of God's will. Yet even as he offered words of comfort, many in the congregation could not shake the sense that something unnatural had occurred. Hartford would remember that day not as a wedding but as a warning, a story told to future generations of how joy can be stolen in an instant, how pride and envy, hidden in the human heart, can lead to devastation. And so the bride's tragic death became more than a personal sorrow. It became a cautionary tale, a wound in the fabric of the town itself. The funeral of Catherine Miller had scarcely ended when the whispers began to sharpen into accusations. Hartford was a small town, Secrets seldom stayed buried long. At first people blamed illness or a weakness of the heart. But the violent convulsions, the rapid decline, and the residue around Catherine's lips told a different story to those with discerning eyes. The town physician, Dr. Aberworth, could not quiet his conscience. For several nights after the tragedy, he sat at his desk by lamplight, replaying the scene again and again. He compared Catherine's final symptoms to the medical text he kept from his training in Boston. Every detail pointed to one grim conclusion: arsenic poisoning. He had seen it once before, in a farmer's child who had mistaken the powder for sugar. The burning in the throat, the spasms, the sudden collapse. It was all too familiar. At last, unable to remain silent, Dr. Aberworth called upon Jonathan Pierce. The young widower sat in his shuttered home, pale and broken, refusing food and sleep. When the physician entered, Jonathan rose with hollow eyes. "Tell me the truth, doctor," he said, his voice hoarse. "Did Catherine suffer an illness or something else?" The physician hesitated, knowing the weight of his words. "Jonathan," he said gently, "I fear your wife was poisoned." The room fell into silence. Jonathan gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white. "Poisoned? By whom? Who would harm her?" "That," the doctor replied gravely, "is what must be uncovered. But mark me, this was no accident. The signs are clear." Jonathan's grief turned to horror. He demanded an inquiry, and soon the matter reached the ears of Hartford's magistrate. An investigation was ordered, and suspicion quickly narrowed upon those closest to the bride. Who had poured her wine? Who had stood near her cup? Servants were questioned. Guests recalled seeing Mrs. Eleanor Pierce rise from her seat and carry a goblet to the bride. Some thought little of it at the time, imagining it the courtesy of a hostess. But now, under scrutiny, the detail took on a sinister cast. Jonathan at first resisted the notion. To suspect his own mother was unthinkable. She was stern, yes, and often cold, but she was still his mother. Yet the pieces began to align in ways he could not ignore: her visible disdain for Catherine, her lack of tears during the tragedy, her strange composure when all others were distraught. One servant, trembling as she spoke, confessed that she had once seen a small vial in Eleanor's possession, tucked away in a drawer. Eleanor had explained it was arsenic for rats in the cellar. Few thought of it again until now. The magistrate summoned Eleanor for questioning. She arrived dressed in mourning black, her face pale but resolute. Before the assembly, she denied all accusations. "I loved my son's bride," she declared. "I would never harm her. The poison must have come from elsewhere. Perhaps a mistake in the kitchen, perhaps some malady unknown to us." But the magistrate pressed further. Witnesses spoke of her strained relationship with Catherine. Neighbors recalled her sharp words, that no woman was good enough for Jonathan, that Catherine lacked refinement. And when the vial of arsenic was at last produced, hidden among her belongings, the courtroom gasped. Eleanor faltered for the first time. Her lips trembled, her eyes darted toward Jonathan, who stood at the back of the chamber, his face etched with betrayal. She attempted to speak again, but her words caught in her throat. The weight of evidence was crushing. The trial that followed consumed Hartford. Each day, crowds gathered outside the courthouse, straining to hear the testimony. The story of the poisoned bride spread beyond the town, reaching neighboring communities, where it was retold with a mixture of sorrow and outrage. Jonathan himself was called to testify. He stood with shaking hands, his voice breaking as he described Catherine's final moments. When asked about his mother's relationship with his bride, he could not lie. She never welcomed her, he admitted. She spoke often against her, though Catherine only sought to honor her. The court listened, and the verdict became inevitable. Eleanor Pierce was found guilty of murder by poison. The sentence, as the law demanded, was death by hanging. The judgment shocked the town, yet many felt justice had been served. Still, there was no triumph in the verdict, only sorrow. A mother condemned for murdering her son's wife, a son left with both a widow's grief and a criminal's shame. Hartford's joy had turned into a tale of ruin. On the day of her sentencing, Eleanor was brought before the crowd. She carried herself with rigid dignity, but her eyes betrayed a storm of regret. At last, when given a chance to speak, she whispered words that chilled those who heard them. "I loved my son too much," she said. "Too much to share him, and now I have lost him forever." Jonathan did not attend the execution. He could not bear to see his mother's life ended, even after all she had done. Instead, he remained in his shuttered home, mourning not only his wife but also the mother he had once trusted. Hartford carried the wound for years. Parents told their children the tale as a warning that jealousy and pride, if left unchecked, can destroy both the innocent and the guilty. Catherine's name became a symbol of purity and lost promise. Eleanor's, a symbol of what envy can breed in the human heart. The town learned that true family is built not upon control or pride, but upon love and acceptance. Eleanor's judgment was more than a punishment for. It was a lesson written in the sorrow on our committee. Do would count. Law 925 would like me to also expand the sixth keynote, the lesson for generations, into 900 words, giving it the weight of a final chapter that ties the whole story into a moral message for today's readers. You said, the lesson for generations, expand this keynote into 900 words. ChatGPT said, great. Let's close the story with a 900-word expansion of the sixth keynote. The lesson for generations. I'll treat this as the final chapter, giving it the feel of a historical conclusion mixed with moral reflection, so it resonates beyond 1841 Hartford and motivates readers today. Years passed after the tragedy in Hartford, yet the memory of Catherine Miller's death did not fade. The streets where she had once walked with a gentle smile seemed quieter without her. The church where she had spoken her vows remained heavy with the memory of both joy and sorrow. For Jonathan Pierce, life became a long road marked by grief. Though he eventually reopened his shop and carried on with the duties of life, he never remarried. Friends said that Catherine remained his only love, a flame extinguished too soon but never forgotten. But while Jonathan bore his sorrow in silence, the town of Hartford carried the story forward. Parents told it to their children, not to frighten them, but to impress upon them the dangers of unchecked envy and pride. Preachers used it in sermons as a modern parable, a reminder that sin often begins quietly in the heart before erupting into destruction. Neighbors repeated it in whispers, warning new brides and young mothers alike that families could only thrive on love, not on rivalry. What gave the tale its lasting power was not merely the crime itself, but the contrast between what should have been and what actually came to pass. A wedding was meant to be the purest symbol of beginnings, a day when families joined together, when old wounds were forgotten, and when love was blessed in the sight of God. Instead, it became a day of endings, poisoned by a heart that could not let go of control. That bitter irony made the tragedy unforgettable. Over time, Hartford's ministers began to use the story of Eleanor Pierce as a cautionary tale during wedding ceremonies. They reminded mothers and fathers that their children's marriages were not about their own pride or ambition, but about the happiness and growth of the couple themselves. Bless them freely. One preacher declared from the pulpit, for to withhold blessing is to plant seeds of sorrow. Many a parent, remembering Catherine, chose to set aside their own misgivings and welcome a son or daughter-in-law with kindness rather than suspicion. The tragedy also influenced how people in Hartford spoke about women. Catherine was remembered not as a victim alone, but as a model of gentleness, generosity, and dignity. Children were told stories of how she had taught poor families, little ones, to read, how she had cared for the elderly in her neighborhood, how she had carried herself with humility despite her beauty. In her, people saw the embodiment of virtues they wished to preserve for future generations. Eleanor, on the other hand, became a warning against the darker sides of human nature. People did not speak of her name with hatred alone. They spoke of her with sorrow, as a woman who allowed jealousy to become her master. Beware the poison you carry in your own heart, townsfolk would say, for it can destroy more surely than any vial of arsenic. Mothers especially told the tale to daughters, reminding them that love must never become possession, and pride must never silence compassion. Beyond Hartford, the story traveled. Newspapers carried accounts of the trial, and the details found their way into pamphlets and journals. In New England and beyond, People read of the poisoned bride and shook their heads at the folly of envy. Some dismissed it as a local scandal, but many took it to heart, weaving it into the moral fabric of their communities. What made the lesson endure was its universality. Every generation faces the temptation of envy, between siblings, between neighbors, between in-laws. The human heart has always struggled to balance love with pride, to let go when it is time, and to rejoice in another's happiness rather than resent it. Hartford's tragedy stood as a reminder that failure to master those struggles could lead not only to sorrow but to ruin. Even today, when people hear the story, they find themselves reflecting on their own families. A mother might ask, do I support my child's choices, or do I try to control them out of fear of losing them? A young spouse might wonder, do I honor my partner's family with patience, even when I feel unwelcome? A neighbor might consider, do I rejoice when others prosper, or do I let jealousy gnaw at my heart? These questions, though born from an event in 1841, remain relevant in every age. Jonathan Pierce lived out his days quietly, never fully recovering from the twin losses of his bride and his mother. Yet his sorrow also carried a message. He was often heard telling younger men in town, cherish what you have, for it may be gone before you think to treasure it. In his grief, he became a voice of warning and wisdom, urging others not to take for granted the blessings that life affords. And Catherine, though her life was brief, left a legacy greater than many who lived long. Her name became linked not only with tragedy, but with the enduring lesson that kindness and humility are never wasted. Though she had been struck down unjustly, her example continued to shape the hearts of those who remembered her. In the end, Hartford's tragedy was not only about death, it was about the choice each person faces daily to let jealousy rule or to let love guide. Eleanor chose jealousy and was destroyed by it. Catherine chose love and was remembered for it. Jonathan chose devotion and carried his cross faithfully. Each path bore fruit, one bitter, one sweet, and the difference lay in the heart. Thus the townsfolk said, and still say when telling the tale, let no one's wedding turn to mourning by your hand. If envy whispers, silence it with love. If pride rises, cast it down with humility. And if bitterness tempts you, remember Hartford, and remember Catherine. The story became more than history, it became a mirror. Each generation looked into it and saw themselves, not merely the bride, the groom, or the mother-in-law, but the human heart laid bare, capable of both poison and blessing. And through that mirror, they were urged to choose the better path, lest tragedy repeat itself.